So this is an overview of history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East, starting after the Second World War. Now, immediately after the Second World War, really there was no history of violence, imperialism, unlike European powers, as far as the Middle East was concerned. The U.S. government certainly realized that the Middle East constituted a strategic region, looking at geographic location, oil, of course, energy security, and looking also potential military bases to balance against the Soviet Union. So we have interregional confrontations between Arab states and, of course, between Arab-Israeli conflicts. That was the main variable determining U.S. national security making. What were the Cold War interests in the Middle East? One, of course, is crucial to align Arab Middle East with the West for economic, cultural, and political reasons. Israel, formation of Israel, 1948, that assumed strategic importance, looking at historical significance, looking at, the US was the first country to recognize Israel after declared independence and sovereignty. And energy security, of course. In 1947, the Middle East supplied half of the oil consumed by US armed forces, and most of that fueling the Marshall Plan. The CIA made it very clear at the end of the 40s that Middle East was essential to US security. Now, again, if you look at 1945, what the US represents as far as the Middle East is concerned, it really was a benign power. It had no history of colonialism, no history of interference. Commercial ties were rather good. The balance sheet, we are actually quite liked in the Middle East, unlike our European powers. So again, kind of imagine how that environment was compared to what it is today. The Suez Crisis, 1956, it really was neo-colonial fantasies by the Brits, the French, as well as the Israelis, wanting to get rid of Nasser of Egypt, and basically, trying to pick a fight with the Egyptians. It was the interference of the United States which forced the Israelis, the British, and the French out, and that really was the beginning of the Pax Americana in the Middle East. That was the beginning that the United States started to act as an outside power. Then starting to, of course, intervene itself in Middle East affairs. Now, several countries stand out of how U.S. Middle East policy started to be forged. One was that special relationship with the Saudis. FDR negotiated a security partnership with the Saudis. And of course, the big deal here was to secure oil concessions. That started the Aramco deal in Saudi Arabia at that time, 50-50. It was split of royalties 50-50 to the Saudis and to American oil companies extracting that oil. This really started to pave the way for influx of not only American but also other European companies extracting oil. And with that, that was the beginning of massive amount of influx of petrodollars in Saudi Arabia, making it, that wealthy country it is today. Now, the U.S., in addition to having special relationship with certain countries like the Saudis, there were also attempts to establish security regimes. We had the Tripartite Declaration 1950, France, the UK, the US would supply arms to Arab states, and that, of course, a contingent on non-aggression, internal security, self-defense, or defense against regional outside aggressors. So that, of course, was meant not to attack the Israelis, but it was meant to help from Soviet allied or the Soviet Union itself aggression. Turkey and Greece joined NATO in 1952. Truman tried to erect a mutual defense system for the Middle East, just like NATO for Europe and the United States. That was rejected by the Egyptians, who were under Nasser fiercely anti-imperialist and anti-Western. The Baghdad Pact, mutual defense pact between Iraq, Iran, Turkey, and the UK, again, that was sabotaged by Nasser of Egypt, who saw it as just another Western conspiracy to intervene in Middle East affairs. It really was after these failures that the US started to negotiate bilateral defense treaties. One is Iran, Turkey, and Pakistan. Pakistan being outside of the Middle East, of course. But that was the beginning of the United States having these bilateral treaties rather than actually trying to seek to have a multilateral defense agreement in the Middle East. Now, what were the Cold War trends? It was not a straightforward confrontation like it was in Europe, but it really was beset by strategic cross currents. The US had political strategic interest in Israel, but the main economic interests were, of course, in the Persian Gulf, with the very countries that were at war with Israel. So that was that rather ironic dual relationship the United States has, and has till this very day, because most of these countries are still technically at war with Israel, do not have peace agreements with Israel, save for Jordan and Egypt. The Soviet Union also established strategic alliances with Arab socialist regimes, Egypt and Iraq, even though those two actually repressed communist parties. So overall, the Middle East was subject to these Cold War games, but local states really managed to take advantage of these of the bilateral, the Cold War between the two superpowers for their own ends, because it really was a passive object of external strategic rivalry. So what we did not have the same as Latin America or Africa or Asia, where we had proxy wars, or we had really massive interference by the two superpowers in domestic affairs, coup d'etats, etc., etc. This really did not happen in the Middle East. We have four phases of the Cold War in the Middle East. The first one, 40s, 50s, US-Soviet rivalry was concentrated in the non-Arab northern tier, so Turkey, Iran. The Soviets at that time, of course, still lacked the capacity to challenge the United States. So again, it was immediately after the Second World War, looking at the Russians refusing to withdraw its troops, which it had occupied in Iran during the Second World War, together with the British. That was the first time that this UN Security Council really actually was in session and ordered the Soviets out from Iran. You could say that the Cold War started in Iran over Soviet refusal to withdraw troops. The second one, 55-74, USSR established itself a major ally of Arab nationalist regimes. We have the Iraqis, Syrians, Egyptians, Libya, South Yemen. But we also have that the US established really good relationship with Turkey and Iran. 74-85, continuous East-West maneuvering. We had the loss of Iran in 79, and then of course we have the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. Again, Afghanistan being outside the Middle East, but the Carter Doctrine made it clear that the Carter Doctrine said, if you use Afghanistan as a launch pad to the Persian Gulf, we will consider it just like an attack on mainland United States. And then 89, Cold War ended. Early in the Middle East, we had the end of the Iran-Iraq War. PLO recognized Israel. The Soviets had left Afghanistan, and Yemen merged to form a single state, Yemen really being the only country which South Yemen was actually a socialist regime. Now again, looking at special relationship with countries, Iran, of course, the coup d'etat in 53, which ousted Prime Minister Mossadegh, was the beginning of that authoritarian monarchical rule. This, of course, acquired iconic status in Iranian political discourse. In the long term, that certainly led to the 1979 Islamic Revolution, and with that, the departure of Iran as an ally, and many, as Iranians would see, as a stooge of the United States. So after Khomeini took over in 79, it was neither East nor West. We had the Great Satan, but also the Little Satan being the Soviet Union. And it really was a form of non-alignment as far as the Iranians were concerned. Now got the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mentioned 56, invasion of Suez by the French, the Brits, and Israel. And, the US intervened and put an end to these neo-colonial fantasies. The regional turning point was 67. It was, preemptive war by the Israelis against the Syrians and the Egyptians. But that also redrew the entire map of the Middle East within 6 days. 73 war imposed by Cairo was seen by the Nixon administration as a Soviet assault on Western interest, and Israel received full support. Kissinger even went on nuclear alert in order to protect the Israelis. And then we had the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. This was Israelis invaded Lebanon in order to destroy the PLO headquarters there. And again, very poor relation with the United States under the Reagan administration, even though it received encouragement. But there was a lot of pressure put on Israel by the US to withdraw. And then largely, Israel throughout this conflict really succeeded in framing the Palestinian guerrilla resistance as an international as terrorism narrative, rather than as two countries, two nations fighting for sovereignty. Looking at the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, from the very beginning, the staunch support the US had for Israel really made this a non-starter. As I just earlier, it was the narrative which was created it was terrorism. It wasn't two nations fighting over sovereignty, Palestine and Israel. The Intifada really changed a lot of that, as you had Palestinians throwing rocks at Israeli, US-supplied Israeli gunships and tanks. A lot of living rooms in the United States, seeing this footage, started to empathize with the Palestinian cause, and it put a lot more pressure on successive US governments to actually push for peace. After 1993, of course, that was the turning point. After Clinton negotiated the Oslo Accords, this narrative, really changed to these two nations wanting peace. So if you look at how different doctrines influenced the Middle East during the Cold War, and also the two-way street, how Middle East affairs have influenced U.S. administrations, the Truman Doctrine, giving aid to Turkey and Greece to fend off the Soviets, Eisenhower Doctrine, that was interference in the Suez Crisis, Kennedy Doctrine, promoting social reform, to preempt revolution, that of course we had in big land reform initiatives in Egypt and Iran. Nixon Doctrine encouraged greater role by influential regional powers. So, the idea that we give more money and more military equipment and we let those countries act as proxies. That was Saudi Arabia as well as Iran. Carter Doctrine, protect interest in the Gulf against the Soviets after the invasion of Afghanistan. And then the Reagan Doctrine gave green light for Israel to invade Lebanon under the pretext of this is all anti-Soviet. But then ultimately it really affected relations quite poorly. So we've seen that the Middle East displayed quite a individuality in terms of ideology and resilience, and mainly made an uneasy partner for both the Soviets and the Americans. If you look at out of 18 Arab states, only South Yemen embraced socialism as a form of governance. Looking at Egypt, looking at Iraq, who again under the Ba'athist regimes were technically socialist, they really kept Soviet influence and local commitment very much at bay. Now, these are the 5 important periods after the Cold War: Iraq invasion of Kuwait in 1990, Israel-Palestinian Declaration of Principles, Al-Qaeda attacks on the US, invasion of Iraq, and the Arab Spring, and then the civil war in Syria from 2011 till today. Now again, the Persian Gulf War, it was this switch from Iraq being somebody the United States liked to use to balance against the Iranians throughout the Iran-Iraq War, to one which the United States no longer saw as possible to have normal relations with. So National Security Directive 26 under President H.W. Bush, where they sought normal relations with Iraq, really was then put back in a drawer because the Pentagon, a year later, identified so-called rogue states as threats to U.S. security, and Iraq was put within that category. Now again, what of course caught the U.S. off guard, and I said that in the previous lecture on how we do not learn from history in terms of the failure of deterrence, is that the U.S. failed to actually credibly threaten or credibly deter, I should say, against the Iraqis prior to the invasion of Kuwait in 1990. Now again, the US did a lot of credible deterrence afterwards in terms of Desert Shield, which was 100,000 troops to Saudi Arabia, which in the long term really annoyed bin Laden and other Wahhabi Islamists in that country. But again, whatever the US did after the invasion, it failed to do prior to the invasion of Kuwait. The Senate and House authorized to use force to liberate Kuwait in 91, and Desert Storm itself was a formidable military campaign which destroyed Iraqi forces in Iraq and occupied Kuwait. Saddam tried to drag in the Israelis, which was resisted by Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, even though Cheney wanted to unleash the Israelis. That would have shattered, as rightly as Colin Powell said, that would have shattered the Arab coalition. So the US dispatched Patriot missiles to defend the Israelis, as well as did not allow the Israelis to fly over US-controlled airspace in Iraq. Desert Storm, as I said, was a very, very quick, massive aerial assault against Iraqi forces. That highway of hell was the one connecting Kuwait to Iraq. One of the movies I encourage you to watch is Three Kings, which really captures that both the geopolitics, sectarian politics, and also looking at the military power the US had during that time very, very well. So Three Kings, I highly recommend that movie. Now again, why didn't the US go all the way? Why did Bush decide just to liberate Kuwait? That's the speech he gave, and he says that would only plunge that part of the world into perpetual conflict, and we would assign young soldiers to a fruitless hunt for securely entrenched dictator in what would become an unwinnable urban guerrilla war. So again, if you want to understand why Bush was so opposed to his son later invading Iraq in 2003, it was very much because of that recognition. So again, that was that very realist thinking that our mission was to get the Iraqis out of Kuwait. We're not in the business of regime change. Now again, what happened after the war, the post-war failures? We had the policy of dual containment against Iran and Iraq. So the notion was non-proliferation for the Iraqis to dismantle their WMD program, at the same time also containing the Iranians from becoming too powerful in the Middle East. Now, at the end of the decade, 2000, the Middle East remained the world's largest arms market, the highest of any region in the world. We had Israelis still not signing the non-proliferation treaty, having nuclear weapons. So we had, continuous old crises, old conflicts, new conflicts at the end of the decades. And what we had was, state rivalry between countries, but then also transnational conflict of jihadi groups within those countries. So both targeting US-aligned regimes, and of course, 9/11 showed it also very much attacked the US itself. The peace process, so again, the peace process between Israel and Palestine went off to a good start. The Algiers pronouncement by the PLO, renouncing terrorism. The Oslo Accords was the first time that the Israelis and Palestinians recognized each other's right to exist. However, again, looking at the end of the decade, 2000, you could even say looking at it, and two decades later, preconditions were not met. Commitment by Israel to evacuate the territory seized in 1967 was not met. Arab world as a whole still cannot normalize relations with Israel. And there's a determined commitment by the US to drive forward the implementation of Declaration of Principles, which simply is not happening. Bigots and hardliners on both sides continue to proclaim intolerant and maximalist goals, which really drowned any form of diplomacy, and that all died completely at the end of the decade when the second Intifada took place. And it was after that that Israel largely continued with the securitization of the Palestinian society. So that shows you 20 years of talks, 20 years of keeping Palestinians occupied. Israeli population, settler population in the occupied territories doubled. So again, if you're looking, this is from 1993 till 2013, a lot more restrictions, increasing Palestinian fragmentation, So we're not only looking at the segregation fence, but we're also looking at the restrictive movement of Palestinians inside the occupied territories, and in particular looking at the West Bank here. Again, crisis confrontation with radical Islam. Really, Al-Qaeda had arisen out of different fundamentalist currents. Broadly, Afghanistan served as the incubator of Islamic Jihad from the group Islamic Jihad under Ayman Zawahiri coming from Egypt, and Wahhabi radicals coming from Saudi Arabia, led by bin Laden. So again, Zawahiri, Islamic Jihad, bin Laden, Wahhabi radicals met in Afghanistan fighting the Soviets in the 80s. That's where they earned their battle stripes, the following, and both had this vision of fighting the near enemy and far enemy, near enemy being Middle Eastern countries allied with the United States, and the far enemy being the US as well as Israel. That was the mothership, if you like, the far enemy. The idea of civilization clash, of course, received dramatic reinforcement by US counteraction. So again, Al-Qaeda probably was hoping on this overreaction by the United States and going all the way and invading Iraq in 2003, and which that really had ushered the entire region into perpetual war for over a decade now. Beyond the rhetoric, terrorist groups in the Middle East reflect primarily conflicts within their own society. So again, we have regionally, we saw this growing strength of armed Islamist groups, widespread anger in the US, pioneered by anti-secularist fanatics in Egypt and elsewhere. They're, embracing this very, very strong anti-imperialist agenda. And then internationally, we have three successive forms of colonialism, Cold War, and then the globalization. So these were, three superimposed periods of asymmetrical relations between the Middle East and the West. And that gradually led to this militarization of opposition, grown out of really, really poor state-society relations. So again, looking at radical Islamism in the Middle East, in particular all the way until the Arab Spring, it really was that reaction that modernity, enfranchisement of us hasn't happened fast enough. We have all of these securely entrenched authoritarian regimes which are in bed with the Europeans and the Americans. Now again, I mentioned earlier Iraq and Syria, total war, the invasion of Iraq, 2003 was a massive systemic shock to the region. Start of US-made regional proxy war between the US and Iran, and Iraq had become a regional hub for terrorism. Again, the Syrian civil war, the Saudis and other Gulf states were quick to demarcate the political conflict inside Syria along sectarian lines. The Iranians were just too happy to take the bait, and what really was a popular protest and that violent conflict over regime change in Syria by Syrians became a complete civil war along sectarian lines. And now by 2016, 2017, the most powerful groups, armed groups in Syria are in fact Islamist groups, ISIS and others. So if you look at the story of US policy in the Middle East, that's one of growth and involvement and power. So this is from energy security and other concerns of Soviet takeover led the US to gradually take on a very dominant position and intervening policy in the Middle East. It became dominant foreign power. It faced resistance, Mossadegh in Iran, Nasser in Egypt, Gaddafi in Libya, and of course later Khomeini in Iran, seeking independence and national sovereignty over perceived or real US dominance and hegemony. The Arab-Israeli conflict provided perpetual challenge to US diplomacy. To this day, there is no peace between Israel and the Palestinians, and there is no Palestinian sovereign state. And again, we had successive administrations which were a positive role. We have Carter, we had Clinton. But again, it remains elusive. We'll discuss this more in the module on US peacemaking actions in the Middle East. Persian Gulf security, again, it was offshore balancing, making the Iraqis and the Iranians bleed between 1980 and 1988. Then the invasion of Kuwait led the US to actually have military presence in the region, and it was after that that dual containment of Iraq and Iran really failed to provide any meaningful result. And then looking at the overreaction by George W. Bush, the war of choice, the invasion of Iraq in 2003, made sure that the US remained deeply involved in Middle East affairs and had also ushered the conflict, the Middle East, into total war for over 1 decade.